My husband Steve is here. He's a retired pharmacist, so if you have a drug interaction or question, you can talk with him about it. For those of you that don't know me, I live close to Fort Worth, Texas, in Weatherford in Parker County. We lived in Keller, which is North Fort Worth, for 20 years, and before that, we lived in Southwest Kansas, just straight up over the Panhandle. So, a prairie girl to start out with, and went back to my native Texas roots, and I'm very happy to say I got here as quick as I could. And we have a lot of Louisiana family members too that you're going to hear about a little bit on in the lecture. But I grew up in a family where a sewing machine lived on the dining room table at my mother's house and on my grandmother's house. I just thought that's where they were supposed to be because someone was always sewing. I had a lot of sisters. My mother had a lot of sisters. My grandmother was just a natural. There wasn't anything that she couldn't make or produce. I can't believe the things that she made for us when we were little girls growing up. And some of my greatest memories was actually it was on an Easter, and my mother and grandmother were working together, and there was a snip, snip, snip of the scissors, and then the hum of the sewing machine all night long. And the next morning, my sisters and I, 4 of us, all woke up to new little Easter dresses on the end of our bed. So that was kind of the family that I grew up in, lots of 4-H sewing, and even when I was being the third of the 4 sisters, of course 4-H was a big part of our life, and I didn't realize that I wasn't a 4-H member when I was 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And when I got to be 8, all my sisters were like, "Oh, you get to actually be a member now." And I was like, "Well, what have I been? I thought I had been a member." But anyway, I got to do all of the 4-H stuff and was in the style review and all that, and actually won grand champion at the style review and then also at the fair that year with some of my sewing. So I guess I've been a sewing entrepreneur for a long, long time. Now, when my husband and I got married, he was in pharmacy school, and towards the end of that, close to graduation, we had friends graduating. A few friends were having some babies, and I thought, well, I've got scraps and I'm going to make some quilts. Now, grew up with quilting. Quilting was always a part of our family, but I had always been garment. I had not really done the quilting process. So a couple of phone calls to my grandmother. I got some of those baby quilts made, and this was way back in the mid-70s, and I got hooked. I got the quilt pox before I even knew that there was such a thing. And then as we graduated and we started having our children, of course I was still sewing. I had boys, so not as much sewing as you would for a little girl, so I jumped over and started doing a lot of quilting. I wanted some quilts for myself, for my home, for some friends, and I jumped in and started doing them. And I found out they're not very easy. I could buy some fabric and whip up some clothes and wear them to school the next day, but I was not having that same luck with my quilting. I thought, okay, what is happening here? I can do tailoring, I can do bound buttonholes, I can put in a zipper in 10 minutes. You know, why am I having so much trouble putting all of these little squares and triangle units together and making all of them have nice sharp points and smooth flat work? I was really struggling, and I realized that it was the triangle unit that was giving me the biggest hassle. So I started thinking about what is actually happening when you're putting a quilt together. So you have a human doing the work of the cutting, the sewing, and the pressing. And you're working with fabric that is a cotton woven fabric. It's going to shift. It's going to change when you press, when you add heat or steam. All of that fiber is going to move around. So we're working with something that has movement to it, and then we're working with a human that isn't perfect. So I thought, okay, how can I make a quilt and remove the human element? The human not having to worry about the cutting, sewing, pressing. How's that going to work? So I thought, okay, if I can sew a bunch of stuff together and then cut it, then I can make it perfect or close to perfect. It's like I've hopped over or improved on that human element of the cutting, sewing, and pressing. So I thought, well, what's the easiest thing to do? Well, that's squares and strips. So I came up with what I call the basic square. And the basic square is a square in the middle, strips on the side. You can use scraps, you can use, cut off your yard goods, whatever. And the strips just have to cover that square, because you're going to do the square and a square system. You have the square and a square tool, and the way you lay it on here and trim it up, you're going to get triangle units. So every time you have a strip on there, it's going to turn into a triangle unit. So I started playing around with this, and I started working with making more triangle units, different triangle units. So I started numbering them and called them options, because from the basic square you have the choice or the option to trim it into any triangle unit that you're looking for. So the first one, option 1, square and a square. Option 2 is when you sew strips around it again and get bigger triangle units. Option 3 is going to be flying geese. Option 4, half square triangles, and so on. And I'm now, after 30 years, up to option 40, brand new option, option 40. So, and it's the same tool, the same ruler, the same concept. So once you understand the basics of the basic square and how to use the ruler, everything now is just, you know, you just keep moving along with what you're doing. So your tool So this is what we call the original ruler. It's the one I've had for 30 years. And you have a 90-degree angle over on the right side, and you have 60s and 120s on the other. And those make skinny triangle units, and we'll look at those in a little while. But let's concentrate on the 90, the normal square, because that's in our brain more. Those images are already in our head. So we're going to put the tip of that 90 right into the tip or the corner of that square that was in the middle. And the lines are going to go right over the seam. You have 1/4 of an inch from the 90 tip to the edge of the ruler, and that's your seam allowance. So even if the square wasn't cut perfect or sewn perfect, or it moved a little bit in the pressing of it, you're still going to get that perfect 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And as you trim each corner and rotate around, you keep the unit square, even if your sewing is off. Get it on here a little bit for you. Okay, so the 90 is right in the tip of that corner square. The lines from the 90 go right over the seam. You're going to cut right across that side, getting that perfect 1/4 of an inch. And then after you make your first cut, you turn it and you go to the next cut, and you use the lines that are horizontal and vertical to keep the outside square. So even if the human element in here, your 4 cuttings, your 4 sewings, you press twice, so you have 10 human elements. If you start looking at quilts and looking at the seam and realizing each seam is 3 human elements. So what we try to do in the approach of how we make our units and design the quilts and put them together is to remove as many of those human elements as we can. And we'll talk about that as we go in on some of the quilts. So you keep the outside square even if your inside where your human is off a little bit. And you always have that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So when you sew this to your next piece, you already have that good point. Usually you're trying to, I don't know if you've thought about it, but to make just a plain square and a square, if you're in the traditional part of the world, you cut a square and cut 4 triangle units. Then you try to find the perfect middle.